Learning how to illustrate your core ideas can make your research more accessible, more memorable, and as a result, get your grants funded and your papers cited more often. Many of you may not recognize this image, but this was the fundamental discovery of the structure of DNA. However, this is the image that most of you remember, and this is a conceptual image, one that's stuck in our minds and persists to this day. This was the image published by Watson and Crick. So what is a conceptual diagram? A conceptual diagram is an illustration that depicts the essential attributes of a system using symbols. It consists of a model, which is an abstract representation of a system or a process, and is really a way to illustrate the concepts that we develop in our work. Why should we use conceptual diagrams? Well, first of all, it helps to clarify our thinking. The fundamental act of creating a conceptual diagram can help us to clarify our ideas. Words can be ambiguous. An image commits us to the message being portrayed. It helps us to identify essential elements and priorities, and it clarifies relationships that are difficult to describe in words. Most of all, it simplifies complex ideas. Good conceptual diagrams are widely used, and they're often modified, copied, or even stolen. Characteristics of effective conceptual figures include the use of symbols or illustrations. Words are just not sufficient. That's what we're trying to represent and trying to replace with our conceptual figures. Of course, they must be simple and clear, have a consistent graphic style and color scheme. Every aspect of the figure needs to be thought out. Colors should be used with careful thought. Legends and or labels should be provided. And they should be targeted towards a specific audience, just like you're writing. Here's a typical diagram in the field of ecology, where words, boxes, and arrows are used to represent the relationships between objects. While this adds something beyond what can be explained in text, it takes a long time to really study this diagram to understand what is trying to be represented. Furthermore, the use of words is rather inconsistent. Some of these words are referring to processes, some of them are things, some of them are ideas. Here's a conceptual figure that I recently developed for a review chapter. Here, the arrows represent feedbacks between different characteristics of the environment and different processes. While I don't think this is a perfect diagram, there are a few things that I think are good about it. First of all, I used color very carefully to represent a different feedback loop, that of the feedbacks related to intensified precipitation patterns compared to the feedbacks represented by CO2 and warming, shown in black. This is actually the published version. And what I did in the published version is I added this subtle background of a tree, ground level, and roots. And I think that it makes a big difference because instantly it gives you some context. When you look at this diagram, you can tell that the processes and characteristics on the top half of the diagram are things that are above the soil level, things that are happening above ground, whereas everything below that level is below ground. And you can see, for example, that nutrient availability is directly affecting the primary productivity of plants. So that even that little bit of graphics adds a lot of context to this image. One thing that I've observed is the importance of symbols. So symbols are a marker character used as a conventional representation of an object, function, or process. The reason symbols are so important is because they're universally and instantly recognized by most people. So we should use symbols instead of words whenever possible. They're more universal than words, they become ingrained in our memory, and we can process more information more quickly. Symbols have been used throughout human history, and again, they are universal. Most of us could spend some time looking at this figure and interpret some meaning from it. If these were written in letters, which are also symbols, it would be much more difficult to understand. Here's a diagram that I used in a proposal. And I've used symbols such as clouds and rain, the sun, plants, and soil to represent different aspects of the system. And again, it makes it easy to see very quickly what this figure is about, and it helps to remember this figure. Here's a figure by one of my colleagues and mentors, Josh Schimmel, that's been highly cited in our field. And you'll see that here he's trying to depict different cases in which plant roots exert controls on nitrogen availability. Now, Josh is no artist, and I'll admit this illustration is fairly crude, but nonetheless, even this crude illustration has been very effective in getting these ideas across. And the more people that understand your ideas, the more people cite your work, and the bigger influence you have on the field. Here's a figure that I drew for a proposal that was funded by the National Science Foundation. And here I used this kind of cartoon to depict what would happen in Arctic tundra with increasing nitrogen availability. And I think the use of this illustration made it really clear what we were trying to predict in our hypotheses, and was much more powerful and complemented the more detailed description we gave in the text. Here's another figure that I drew for a review paper that was led by Rich Conant, another colleague at Colorado State University. Here, we're trying to depict the complicated feedbacks that affect the storage of soil carbon in response to temperature. Some of my colleagues that co-authored this with me, were reluctant to adopt this kind of unique style, this modern style of illustration. I will say, though, that during the process of trying to develop this figure, we really had to dig deep and really talk to each other about what we were trying to say in words, because as you try to draw it, there's no ambiguity. You have to know exactly what you're trying to depict. So the process of developing this figure was really helped us to clarify our ideas. And I think this figure is effective in displaying what is really a rather complicated set of interactions. So how can you make a conceptual figure? Well, first of all, you really have to clarify your ideas. It's hard to draw until you really know what you're trying to say. I often don't create figures until the very end of a paper or a proposal, because that's the only time when I really understand the details of what we're trying to depict. Like anything else, you have to edit, and sketch. You might start on the back of a napkin, you might start on a whiteboard, and you might change your ideas and iterate. It's a process. Next, I suggest replacing words with symbols wherever possible. So go back and as you edit, try to simplify the diagram using symbols. Use color and size as additional indicators of facts. And finally, if you're not inclined towards illustration, and I have to admit I'm not particularly good at it myself, either learn how to use a professional image program like Adobe Illustrator, or else I think it's worth the investment to pay a freelance or staff illustrator to improve your figures. I want to illustrate how important it is to use a professional illustration program like Adobe Illustrator. Here's a conceptual figure that I drew for a proposal we recently submitted to an astrobiology program. I tried to generate the same figure in Microsoft PowerPoint, which is widely used, but PowerPoint is really a program made for developing presentations, not illustrations. You can see that it's really hard to get that same level of quality in PowerPoint as you can in a program like Adobe Illustrator or a free program like Inkscape. So I'm going to let my slide do the summary for me. And I'd like to thank these resources that really helped me to develop these ideas.